Okay, we are a live webinar. Hello to everybody. My name is Travis Chamberlain. I'm going to be the facilitator for this presentation on democratizing measurement, a case study from Wellbeing Public Policy by Drs. Anna Alexandrova and Mark Fabian of Cambridge. I'm going to just take a moment so we can get everybody into the room. We do have a chat that's available and a question and answer function. And so attendees are welcome to post questions as our presenters move along, and the committee that's here will be relaying those questions to the presenters so that they can respond to them, and we can get kind of a organic dialogue process going as much as we can. We should have about a 30 to 40-minute presentation of the research, and then ample time to have discussion about the topics that are related, moving through what we've been putting together through the HDCA Graduate Student Network, a webinar series on measuring well-being and questions around well-being impact and policy, purposiveness, and other issues that we find within that context. And contextualism really is a focus of today. So I'm just going to give us a quick biography. Before I do that, I'd also like to say that please make sure to separate your questions from the general chat. So we've made a general chat function available. You are welcome to converse with other attendees. Please feel free to let us know where you're checking in from into the chat. We can get a sample of how many different countries and time zones we have connected in today's presentation and discussion. And then, as I said before, we'll be collecting those questions and sharing them with our presenters so that we can have an ongoing kind of collaborative conversation around issues related to the presentation. So our presenters today are Dr. Anna Alexandrova and Dr. Mark Fabian, both of Cambridge. Anna Alexandrova has a PhD in science studies from the University of California, San Diego, and taught at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and Washington University in St. Louis before moving to Cambridge, King's College, where she is now a fellow, directing studies in history and philosophy of science. Dr. Anna Alexandrova wrote a book in 2017 titled The Philosophy for the Science of Wellbeing. It's a book that analyzes different approaches to well-being as well as different definitions. It's really focused on the contextual and purposive related issues that go into well-being measurement, and talks about what makes for the promise or authority of a science of well-being, especially how it focuses on specific kinds of people and well-beings that are relevant for specific contexts. One of the important focuses of the book is the need to recognize and address normative considerations around value-based conflicts that will inevitably arise when a measure of well-being is adopted. There's inevitably this value-ladenness and normative component. And just a quick quote from the introduction of the book: the science of well-being is better off when its values are well articulated and defended. And I show this to be possible, I being Dr. Anna Alexandrova. Further publications, just to give a sense of research that's related to the topic for today, include, and just the titles: Can the Science of Well-Being Be Objective? Is Well-Being Measurable After All? Values and the Science of Well-Being. And is construct validation valid? So Dr. Anna Alexandrova, gives us a number of different ways to look at the practice of measurement and how a recognition and the need to make values transparent infuses that practice. And that's a driving impetus for the research that will be presented today. Dr. Mark Fabian has a PhD from the Australian National University, where he graduated from the Crawford School of Public Policy, and his thesis focused on what well-being is and how to measure it. He works currently on the Measuring Wellbeing project at the Cambridge Bennett Institute for Public Policy, focusing on how citizens and policymakers understand not only well-being, but also its measurement and the legitimacy of well-being policy interventions. Before working at Cambridge, Dr. Fabian was a Fulbright Fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., and he looked at the role of psychological well-being and social capital in the 2016 United States presidential election. Currently, Dr. Fabian is working on the more qualitative strand of well-being and the dimensionality of well-being measurement, focusing on different definitions of or values related to well-being in the context of the United Kingdom welfare system. There's a focus especially on co-production processes, which I think we're going to see today, and what it means for those who are stakeholders in the well-being measurement and downstream policy implications to have a say in the definition of what well-being means for them contextually. This also relates to participatory methods and other similar aspects in the human development and capabilities approach, which is the organization sponsoring this webinar. Dr. Fabian is a co-editor for a recent book titled Hybrid Public Policy Innovations, edited along with Robert Brunig. And that book focuses on reasons for and techniques relevant to evidence-based public policy that uses state-of-the-art empirical techniques. And just a sampling of recent articles, the titles, just to give us a sense. Be Happy, Navigating Normative Issues in Behavioral and Wellbeing Public Policy, Improving Interdisciplinary Research in Wellbeing, and Racing from Subjective Wellbeing to Public Policy, a Review of the Origins of Happiness. So there's a confluence of philosophical understandings of well-being, normative issues and values, and then technical aspects related to the measurement or science of well-being. Welcome to our speakers, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Travis, and thank you to the association for inviting us. I think I'll be speaking for both Mark and myself when I say that we are fans of the capabilities approach and the framework. We are I personally teach a lot of that, and we are trying to keep up with the research. But in this in this project, we did not set out to apply the capabilities approach, and we did not set out to test it, but rather what happened is we set out to co-produce a measure of thriving, which we treat as a synonym for well-being. And capabilities approach came up is useful in our attempt to build this theory in the way we'll tell you about. So let me not talk primarily or not initially about the capabilities approach. Let me just sort of work that into our story. Mark and I are interested in general and have this grant by the various generous institutions mentioned on the slide to explore the idea that measures of well-being should not just be valid and technically apt, but also legitimate, and also really reflect priorities of the people who they are trying to represent. And that we're not the only ones with that desire, but we are exploring a different methodology of making that happen. So let me just tell you the backstory. Our fundamental philosophical motivation is that concepts in social sciences, not just well-being, but more generally, are what philosophers call thick. So here is an influential definition of a thick concept from a political theorist, Elizabeth Anderson. A concept is thickly evaluative if A, its application is guided by empirical facts, B, it licenses normative inferences, and C, interest and values guide the extension of the concept elsewhere. So it's clear how that would apply to well-being. We definitely want to apply the concept of well-being in a way that's guided by facts about people or communities that we're describing, and it does license various normative inferences, such as a community is thriving or is not thriving. And of course, the interests and values very much guide what we put into this concept. So that's a huge challenge for social sciences and for public policy, this thickness. And that is because it challenges the autonomy and the authority of social science to produce this knowledge, because if social scientists could potentially claim themselves to be experts on facts, being experts on values is far, far more complicated. So this is why it's really important to have not just recognize the thickness, but also to have solid and firm and well-articulated methodologies for how to deal with that thickness. So that's what we set out to do more generally. And we started out with distinguishing between, well, let me just give you a preview of 3 claims that we'll be making. We think that there are basically 3 things you can do with thick concepts in social science. You could trying to turn them into thin concepts by redefining them as technical terms in which they lose their evaluative tinge. Say, I use the term as this and that. I don't care if that's what well-being is. Right. The second way is to assume full responsibility for making the value judgment. So say, I, economist, decide that I'm going to be measuring well-being and defining it as such, because I think that's what well-being is. So that's the second way. And the third way would be something like what we are trying to do, co-produce the thick concept with participations of all concerned. And we are definitely fans of the third way, but we also think that it is hard to get right. Nevertheless, just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't try. So this is why we wanted to model the co-production of concept of thriving. And we have partners that we're very, very lucky to have, which is a national poverty charity in the UK called Turn to Us, that already had lots of experience helping people who came upon sudden financial trouble. And they already had lots of experience with co-production. And in this case, though, they allied with us specifically to co-produce an idea of what it means to thrive in the context of grave financial hardship. Okay, so let me just tell you first what is wrong with those 2 other ways that I mentioned for treating thick concepts and why we're not going in that direction. The first thing to say is that treating well-being as a technical term or taking upon yourself the value judgment are both extremely common in the sciences of well-being. In fact, we think most of the work in the various different branches of science of well-being, whether it's happiness economics or positive psychology, do precisely that. So the first manner is, if you've ever been in a seminar where the researchers say, in this talk, I'm going to define well-being as something like life satisfaction. They might be, they might give you good reasons for why they are doing it, but those reasons might have to be with, might have to do with, what lab they're coming from, what data they've got available. So they might be entirely technical issues that guide their operationalization. And so they will often tell you, no, I'm not saying that's what well-being is. I'm just going to use this measure because I think it's interesting in some way or another. So this is both common and also very convenient for researchers because, how are they supposed to know what well-being really is? I mean, they could just say, kind of narrow their responsibility in this way. If somebody then uses their findings to recommend objectionable public policy, they have bought themselves deniability to saying, well, I didn't say that's what well-being is. I just studied the effect of the pandemic on life satisfaction or something like that. So we think this is common, but this is really not totally living up to your responsibility as a social scientist. And the responsibility as a social scientist, just like Max Weber taught, is to study concepts of significance. to the communities that you're describing. So we can disagree exactly what that responsibility encompasses, but it definitely excludes the idea of treating thick concepts as just technical terms that you decided to define in the way that's most convenient given your availability of data or your disciplinary background, etc. Um, another common approach that we encounter is the more ambitious one, well, I'm the economist or I'm the sociologist and I know what well-being is, and I'm going to make that relevant value judgment myself. So you see that very often at the start of the rise of positive psychology, where various key charismatic important scientists in this field like Marty Seligman or Daniel Kahneman would make various claims about well-being is that kind of flourishing, or no, well-being is the objective happiness, or well-being is life satisfaction. And they sort of carry on and proceed to give like a normative argument for it. Every now and then they might cite, I don't know, Aristotle or Bentham to help themselves. But this is sort of a good example of the scientist assuming the responsibility. It's a very honest approach, so it's got that going for it, and it's also faster and simpler. And you ensure independence of your research. But really, there's something wrong with monopolizing the expertise about all things evaluative and normative, when in fact this expertise is distributed. So you might go even further and say there is no such a thing as expertise in moral facts. Some philosophers think that, but we don't have to go that far. We just want to say that whatever well-being is, different people and in different contexts know what it is and have different epistemic access to it. So if you as a researcher have decided to keep that judgment in-house, you're monopolizing that expertise in this objectionable way. So what's the third way? We talked about co-production, but it's a very slippery and difficult term, and it's gotten us in quite a bit of trouble as we research this approach. So it first rises in prominence in the 1960s and 70s in the work of especially economist Elinor Ostrom, and basically it becomes an ideal for public policy. Co-production means delivering public services in an equal and reciprocal relations with professionals, people using services, families and neighbors. So that's one influential definition of co-production, and that's focusing specifically on services. Now, it's clearly not what we're doing here. In science studies, where my disciplinary background is, and our chair's, Travis says, the idea of co-production means that the ways we know and represent the world are inseparable from the ways we choose to live in it. So this is an influential view from Sheila Jasanoff. Scientific knowledge both embeds and is embedded in social practices. So somehow, communities and in which scientists are embedded, both together co-produce what then becomes accepted as scientific facts or scientific instruments. So again, that's a little bit closer, but it's also a bit too general, a grander claim than what we're doing here. Our ideal is far more circumscribed and specific. So we'd like an arrangement for sharing power and responsibility in the process of concept building and measurement. right? So we are interested in producing concepts of well-being that are useful for social research and public policy, and we're interested in measurement, and we're interested in setting up a responsible way of doing so with all the people um, who have a stake in this research. So that's the idea of a stakeholder. So we need to recognize who the stakeholders are of these concepts and these measures. Who is it whose life is affected significantly by certain concepts becoming adopted by organizations or researchers, and we want to involve them and their distinctive expertise into the production of this concept. So that's the meaning in which we use for co-production. But remember, we also have this focus on measurement. So we need to reformulate the ideal of co-production specifically for social measurement. And we follow in this task an influential view of measurement developed by Nancy Cartwright and Norman Bradburn, and defended in a paper together with Johnston Fuller as well. If you think most generally about what measurement involves, you want to distinguish between three stages of it. Characterization, that's when you define the concept, identify its boundaries. Then representation, which is when you define a metrical system that captures this concept, so represents it as a quantity. And then you want to have procedures for how you apply the metrical system to tokens to produce the measurement results. So if we want to co-produce measures, we need to think carefully about how different types of expertise enter at these three different stages. So, as Mark will tell you shortly, when we developed our model of co-producing a measure of thriving with the charity Turn to Us that we're working with, we identified kind of three different expertises, or three different groups of stakeholders. The lived experts, the social workers who are helping people who have been in financial trouble, and then us academics. And I mean, I wouldn't say that there is a firm division of labor such that, you know, the lived experts are in charge of characterization, Mark and I in charge of representation, or social workers in charge of procedures. But I think it is fair to say that some of our some groups of stakeholders will have more to say at each stage, at different stages. So we would like to, you know, all be involved and check each other, but we also would like to recognize that different groups will have more stake and more kind of views, strong views about different steps in measurement process. So as I said, we are very much not the only ones who have tried to you know, make well-being measurement more participatory or co-productive or democratic. I think it is a very ongoing tradition, and of course, in the capabilities approach, there is a you know, you have your own set of practices for how to involve people. But let us tell you about how it works in well-being measurement. So getting high quality citizen input on what well-being is very hard. Different big national organizations or supranational like OECD, or you know, the UK Office of National Statistics, or in other countries, they try to have these big consultations. What does well-being mean to you? And they have people send them postcards answering questions, or they have they open consultations online, and often enough they get these naive comments, naive and not in the sense that they are bad, it's just that naive in the sense that they are not suited to the process of measurement. So people start talking about what makes them happy, whereas that's not necessarily what you're looking for. So all of these common sense judgments, such as money matters or money doesn't matter, they end up being inconclusive, they end up being thin, and most importantly, they end up not being easy to apply in research. Um, so, and I mean, they also, some psychological research shows that they also end up in very conflicting, incompatible judgments about what well-being is. So what we need is some kind of high quality input, something like deliberative views considered, the ones that can be plugged in into measurement. And that's very hard to do as well. So you get, if you want to set up a deliberation, who do you have? Do you invite the whole citizenry? Is very either unwieldy or else unrepresentative if you get a smaller sample. We take cue from some colleagues in the education research in this paper cited here, Daniels et al. 2018, called Democratizing Wellbeing, who have found that it's possible to get quality input if you restrict your question to a particular area. So, for example, what does well-being mean for them in the context of adult education? So, and I myself also have a view that I defended in the book that Travis kindly mentioned, that it's much easier and it's much more realistic to build theories of well-being that are mid-level, that are not about all things considered, people, human beings, Homo sapiens, but rather about people stuck in particular situations. So I think it is much more realistic to figure out what is a well-being of, say, a child refugee than it is to figure out what is well-being, all things considered, for everyone. So we therefore then were already primed to go in this very specific way. So when we got together with Turn to Us, that was perfect because they are a national poverty charity that is focused specifically on people with on professionals actually that who come across unexpected and difficult financial problems. So Mark, would it be okay to hand over to you at this point, and I'll do the slides while you talk?
Yeah, sure. And then I'll hand it back at the conclusion. So as Anna mentioned, Turn to Us is a very large national charity in the UK, but they're almost entirely digital. So they don't have a lot of on-the-ground infrastructure like some more old-fashioned charities. They do everything online, and they have a lot of different aspects of their operation that are relevant to wellbeing. But I guess the two that we kind of most want to emphasize, just to help people get a handle on their products, I guess, is this one tool called the benefits calculator, where people who are curious whether they are eligible for benefits from the government welfare system can go on to the benefits calculator, input all their welfare relevant details, and then the benefits calculator will tell them whether they're eligible for things, and will also carry them through to the government website and also pre-fill some of that government website. So from a behavioral economics point of view, it kind of helps take out a lot of the cognitive load. And then there's also a facility as part of that to help people get back paid for things that they were eligible for in the past but didn't apply for. The second thing that's a really big part of the operation is these one-off grants that they give people, quite large grants of around £1,000. And for that, you have to meet certain criteria. And the big ones are that you have to be a professional, and they usually use either occupational or qualifications to determine whether you're a professional, and you have to have had a life-changing event which is typically illness or an accident or getting laid off or something like that. And then you're eligible for that. Under COVID, they've expanded slightly, but those conditions come from the original trustee, the person who endowed the charity back in the Victorian era, who was quite focused on that sort of thing. So yeah, as Anna mentioned, co-production is quite heavily integrated into Turn to Us's operation already. So pretty much any major change the organization makes to itself and to its services, they get lived experts involved to help them work through that process. Next slide, please. So in the process we ran, as Anna mentioned, we have these 3 groups of experts. So we have the lived experts whose value judgments we really want to be centering. Then we have the professional experts from Turn to Us who are bringing a kind of practical perspective. So how can we ensure that whatever it is that we come up with here is going to be actually usable by the organization and able to be applied? And then we have the academic experts, which is Anna and I and a third colleague, Yamini, who helped particularly with the qualitative research. And we're bringing kind of knowledge of formal theories of well-being, how they fit together, and then the technical requirements of measures. Next slide, please. I should say briefly that one benefit, I think, of this co-production process is that we're trying to learn from each other. So Anna mentioned that if you do the big consultations, you often get these kind of naive comments. And what we can do, because we interact across these 3 groups in one-on-one conversations and group conversations, is that if someone says something that any one of the groups thinks is a little naive, you know, that's not practical or that doesn't actually make sense with something else that's already been said, then the different expertise groups can volunteer that information and we can work through it in a deliberative fashion. So the process we employed in this co-production, and it's not complete yet, so I will only be able to present preliminary results, is that we started with a big online survey. So the charity has really good records of who's used the benefits calculator and who's received grants, and people can volunteer to be sent surveys occasionally. And so we can send a survey out to about 5,000 people. We've got about 2,000 responses. And from that, we got a kind of initial steer of what well-being is to the people that interact with Turn to Us, because we didn't want to go completely off in the wrong paddock. Then we took that information into a working group, which is made up of the 3 academic experts, 4 lived experts, and 5 people from the charity. And that working group then met one-on-one and in small groups over the course of about 2.5 months to discuss what thriving means to people interacting with the charity and how the charity could use it. We've now kind of wrapped that up. So we've got the theory so far. Measurement is still a bit of a work in progress, and I'll talk about that. And the next stage will be to have a workshop where we get another 12 lived experts involved so that we can check whether we've just got a really unrepresentative working group. And then if that workshop, which will be a 1-day deliberative forum, kind of endorses what we produce or says, you know, minor revisions, then we will take it to another online survey to try to get a bit more representativeness out of the process and see if that online survey endorses what we've come up with. So we hope that this kind of balances the need to make these things not unwieldy. So we have this kind of rich qualitative process, but then we also try to get some kind of quantitative verification. In terms of how we selected the lived experts, so the main one is that they have to be the kind of people that would qualify for help from the charity. And all 4 of them have previously, only 3 of them have worked with the charity, but the 4th one got help from a very similar organization. And the second criteria was that they needed to be able to handle the process. So I was actually not privy to this part until they'd already been selected, but Abby, who's our colleague or our point of contact at Turn to Us, was concerned that a lot of the usual people that they use for co-production maybe wouldn't be able to handle the kind of intellectual demands of the process. So the 4 lived experts that we have in the main group, we've been really struck by how erudite they are and how kind of penetrating a lot of their insights and comments are. So they've been really excellent to work with, but we're hoping in the workshop that we'll be able to get some people who are maybe, you know, a bit rough around the edges to see whether the theory still cuts through with them. So we also tried to get, you know, demographic coverage, and we've done pretty well on that, as you'll see in a second. But yeah, so Anna, next slide, please. Sorry, thanks. So yeah, the 4 lived experts, just a very brief introduction. So we have Jay, who was a successful sales executive, extremely successful. But he had a bunch of unresolved childhood trauma, and he also had a very kind of uninvestigated sense that his life was meaningless. And in order to cope with that and the pressures of his job, he started drinking, eventually drank very heavily, got into a lot of debt, ended up in rehab, ended up in homeless shelters, and then in a homeless shelter, found an art room, and discovered that actually his kind of overweening passion in life seems to be painting and community leadership. And so since then has started to thrive once he discovered that. Then we have T, who's a social worker and also a carer for her disabled mother with dementia. She's got personal experience with domestic abuse, and she also has mixed race children. So she has a lot of interesting insights into race relations in Britain. Then we have G, who's also a social worker. She's of Nigerian heritage. She escaped from domestic violence, but as a result of that, ended up in financial hardship. And then we have R, who's a paraplegic with spinal injury. And he quite explicit that he has limited experience with financial hardship, but he's been a very long time disability rights advocate, has a lot of experience with the welfare system and how people with disabilities who are often in financial hardship navigate that system. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick photo of the working group. So us all meeting on Zoom, which has been interesting. Originally, we wanted to do this in person, but things had to change. And the workshop, we still intend to do digitally, but we'll see how we go. Next slide, please. So there's some questions about representativeness of the working group that we'll hope to address in the workshop, as I said. So Jay's experience of homelessness in particular is quite unusual. Like he sees that as almost a good experience that was very transformative for him. I'm not sure that that's standard. We have no single people. Sorry, all single people. So we'd be interested in whether people with different experiences there, particularly around housing, would have different perspectives. And then we have reasonable geographic variation, but with only 4 people, it's obviously not enough. So we'll try to get more people from the north and that sort of thing when we go into the next stage. Next slide, please. Okay, just very briefly. So the methodology that we used to assess the data that came out of this working group process was to do what's called grounded theory, which is that we basically code it sort of line by line descriptively for what is literally being said. And then we come back through the descriptive codes to see if we can organize them in some way into a parsimonious list of themes. And we used a dual approach to that, where Yamini, who has a lot of background in qualitative research but no background in wellbeing theory, came to that in a purely inductive mode, so just letting the data speak for itself. And I, because I have way too much baggage with wellbeing theory, brought a lot of theory to that and just tried to make sense of things according to existing theories and which one they were most compatible with. Interestingly, our descriptive codes were almost identical. And I think in some ways, even the follow-up analysis is also pretty similar. Next slide, please. So some very quick introduction to these key themes, and then I'll explain the theory in a little bit of detail. So a lot of the themes was things that I'm sure that people in the wellbeing space academically are quite familiar with. So freedom and autonomy was very prominent. Basic material needs was very kind of one of the number 1 or number 2 themes. There was a very strong emphasis on stigma and marginalization and oppression and getting away from that, and also on overcoming cultural expectations and finding your authentic values and like what it is that you want to do with your life and what's appropriate for you. And then friends, family, community, and other relationships was the number 1 theme. And then some of the other things were a bit more unique to the context. So there was a very strong emphasis on having advocates and having access to the welfare system and access to political systems more generally. As I mentioned about marginalization and oppression. And then one thing that we were, I guess Aaron and I were not super surprised about, but I think it was quite striking, is that there was very little talk of sort of pleasure and happiness and much more of an emphasis on purpose and kind of being able to contribute to something. Next slide, please. Okay, so the theory that's kind of coming out of it, and this is the one that I've developed, not the one that Yamini's worked on, is kind of like a hierarchical model almost. So the most fundamental thing is capabilities. So I won't explain that in too much detail, but the means to live well. And then you need to have a kind of process. So a lot of people talked about, well, I had the means, but I still didn't live well because I didn't know how to use my means for something helpful. And so we need some kind of model of this process by which we kind of discover what functionings, for example, might suit us. And there's a lot of talk about self-knowledge and self-expression in the data. And one way to make sense of that might be to talk about intrinsic motivations. So trying to discover what values or behaviors are really authentic to you and what would fit you. And then we can talk a bit about the outcomes. So how do you know that you have found the values or behaviors that suit you? And the things that are emphasized here in the data, as I said, not so much pleasure, but feelings of meaning and purpose, connection to people. So a lot of the lived experts had bad connections at different times in their life. They were surrounded by toxic people. And now that they're surrounded by people that are good for them, they really acknowledge that sense of relatedness is now quite real and quite healthy. And then feelings of autonomy, really important. And I think the feeling of autonomy is an interesting complement to the objective state of being autonomous. And then finally, a feeling of competence. So a lot of the time people feel like they're just not in control of their life and they can't do the things that they want to be good at and that sort of thing. And when they were thriving, they felt like they were skillful at life. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, so just a little bit more on that. So capabilities, as I'm sure everyone here knows, are the sort of resources broadly defined that you need to be who you want to be and do what you want to do. Things like income and health, but in our context, also things like circuit breakers were talked about a lot. So you're just under relentless pressure. You're always stressed because you're so close to the breadline, and you just need some time out to be able to think about what you want to do, particularly say with what kind of job you want to do to help you exit poverty in a sustained way, advocacy, access to the system. Once you have those means, though, there's still a sense that you need to know what to do with them. And we might conceptualize this as practical wisdom, but I think that kind of sidesteps the problem. Like you've got to learn that practical wisdom, and we need some kind of account of how people come about that wisdom. So for example, Jay, as I said, was very materially successful, had a good family relationship, more or less. Everything seemed to be going fine. And yet his life was just steadily drifting sideways and going really bad. And he had no idea that art was right for him. He could have afforded art. Art was made available to him then in the homeless shelter. And then he started experimenting with it. And then he was like, oh, this is my thing. So that then we're discovering that, oh, this is my thing. That's a kind of example of coming across your intrinsic motivations. And then we bring in these kind of psychological notions here. And then the end point is, as I said, these feelings of purpose, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm nearly done. So just on measurement, so we're kind of doing the measurement side right now. So this is probably where I think the research has been most enlightening to us. So what's really struck us is that academic theories of well-being do quite well, but academic measures of well-being do really badly in this context. So long form surveys, like what we get in a lot of the quality of life literature or in psychometric surveys, are just too long. So the charity doesn't want to put questions to people as they come to the charity because they see it as a huge burden on stressed people who just need help. And they don't want to turn people away or turn them off with that kind of assault of a battery of questions. Then quantitative measures are often too insensitive to the 3-month treatment window. So the charity has used life satisfaction scales, for example, and they just found that there was basically no change in people's life satisfaction, even though people were reporting that the charity had been very helpful to them. And I've come across this problem in other contexts as well. And then we also got really explicit evidence from the interviews that adaptive preferences are a very live issue in this context, and so it'd be quite difficult to use any sort of mental state-based account. And then the other interesting thing about measurement in our context is that different aspects of Turn to Us as operation have different measurement needs. So they have a kind of policy campaigning arm that was quite emphatic that they really needed quant measures mostly and to be able to produce infographics. And then they just wanted a sprinkle of qualitative stuff so that they have some nice pull-out quotes that kind of bring a human angle to what they're reporting. Meanwhile, the caseworkers who are giving out the grants, they really need a lot of qualitative information about how that money is going to be spent and what effect it's going to have and that sort of thing. So we're currently trying to co-produce bespoke measures with the charity that will be suitable for their needs, but that's ongoing, so I can't say too much about it. Next slide, please. One comment that we get a lot on this research is, well, how are we going to scale this up? How are we going to generalize it? So a lot of the enthusiasm in this space comes from a kind of national statistics point of view of going beyond GDP. And it's a very high level. We're kind of down here in the weeds in a very specific context. How are we going to get up to that level? So we're quite optimistic about this. We just think it's going to be a slow and time-consuming process. So basically, you want to repeat the methodology at various nodes of public policy. So I've already mentioned that it's been done in adult education. I have a colleague doing it in workplace training and so on. You could do it in schools. You could do it in sustainability, infrastructure, whatever you might want. And once you have it at all these different nodes with all their different context-specific mid-level theories, then you'd go up a step and try to abstract out a slightly more generalized theory of well-being and associated measures by combining some of these nodes in a further round of co-production. So we could get together with other charities that work in housing or work in debt, work in drug abuse, etc., and co-produce a theory that works for all of those charities. And that's likely to be slightly more abstracted than the ones that work at each of the individual charities. And in this way, I think you can get a bottom-up process of measurement. And I think this is compatible with the national statistics approach because national statistics is just its own node with its own particular contextual requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, and here I hand back to Anna for the conclusions.
Thank you, Mark. I'll be brief. We think it is really important to co-produce constructs that are value-laden. In this case, we think it is possible to co-produce it on the scale that we have taken on, which admittedly is a small scale, but I think it's the model that matters, and then we can figure out how to generalize it. So as we're going through this process, that's going to be various different requirements of technical validity of a measure or its usability with the people that turn to us as helping, and its philosophical validity. And in all of those cases, we're just going to have to learn how to square that circle, how to make sure that all of those requirements are satisfied in some way or traded off against each other in a way that's legitimate. This was really interesting for us to go through, very big change in our habits as a philosopher, as an economist, big deployment of our kind of emotional skills to conduct all these interviews and to analyze all this data. And the emerging construct, as you have seen, is a kind of a conglomeration of various different ideas like the eudaimonic approach and the capabilities approach, and also a real emphasis on the process. So we really keen to get feedback on how this looks from the capabilities point of view and how that compares to other similar exercises that people have entertained.
Anna, you muted yourself.
My apologies. I'll stop here and give you some works cited. And there's already some nice questions. Travis, I'll let you figure out how to handle those.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to both. That was just fascinating. And to my mind, my research is on capabilities measures using actually a similar construct, perhaps not surprisingly, from Cartwright and co-authors on the characterization, representation, operationalization, and how some of those different aspects of the measure fit together. And I find myself just thinking from that perspective that I've been embedded in for a couple of years, how related and just how important also to get the sense of what's valuable from the people who are living the experience, and then trying to derive through this continuous dialogue an understanding of well-being that fits that context, and then can still be fit to a set of qualitative measures and indicators, quantitative measures and indicators, as well as various qualitative references. But instead of me just talking, what I'm going to try to do is, as much as I can, facilitate questions, including from our committee. Our committee itself is fairly diverse in terms of its interests. And so I encourage those members, as well as everybody in attendance, to post whatever questions we have as we move along. And I'm going to start with the first question that was posted earlier in the conversation. This one seemed to be more so related to the structure of the survey questions that were released. And the question says, what was the process for deciding your survey questions to get the types of responses you were looking for? So I think a methodological question.
Do you want me to
Mark,
take
you
that?
want to go for it? Oh, I can
Uh,
start and you can jump in. So
sure.
Jolene, thank you. That's a really a fair question. So there were there was initially a survey that we gave to all of the participants. No, sorry, all of the people that turned to us has access to all of the people who, you know, who are in its database. And that had to be pretty brief and kind of conventional. So we tried to ask them kind of questions about what they think is an important aspect of their well-being. We gave them some options about what to reply. We tried to make the questions a little bit meta, like we tried to get people to think about what questions would they like to be asked in order for their well-being to be clearer to everyone. What are the common misapprehensions or misunderstandings people have about well-being of people in their situation? But afterwards, once we got into the co-production exercise, like the qualitative portion of it, there were no surveys. There were very structured interviews. Well, sometimes they got a little bit unstructured. So I wonder if if that answers your question. Mark can. I'd like to know what's behind your question, but Mark, do you want to say something here?
Yeah, just two small quick points. So we only had about 5 questions because we had to, it was kind of appended to another communication from the charity. So we didn't want to burden people too much. We basically had a series of ranking questions, like which of these 5 domains is most important to you, and just rank it from 1 to 5. So family satisfaction, life satisfaction, financial satisfaction, job satisfaction, etc. Then we had the ONS 4. So kind of what's most salient or most relevant to your well-being. Is it anxiety? Is it meaning and purpose? Is it feelings of pleasure? Is it overall life satisfaction? Something like that. Then we also have these 2 qualitative questions that Anna mentioned. So we had one that was like, in a tweet or something like that, describe what well-being means to you. And then we also had like, what do people misunderstand about your well-being? Something like that. Yeah. So that was kind of the nature of the questions.
And that third one sounds to me quite fascinating as well, because it sounds like that's really an important part of the bottom-up approach. Maybe ways that people are misperceived. I'll get around. I know I have some questions myself, but I'm going to first I've been collecting from the panelists. So I do want to say, so I'm going to start with some questions actually from Kate. And I just want to say, Kate, I think if you want to jump in, you're welcome to, but I'm going to try to represent these and some other questions. And again, I just want to say that for all others in attendance, your questions are welcome. Looks like we have a couple more that have come in. So I'll get those represented as well in just a moment. One question that was relayed over was, how do you maintain the balance of power? So kind of be a more sociological or political science kind of question between these 3 groups of experts. And then how have you managed to ensure that these different groups are heard equally as you move through this process, this democratic dialogue?
Thank you. A very fair question, Travis. I mean, we've just established some important is good chairing, right? So the turn to us people already knew how to chair those exercises so that nobody dominates. And I mean, I think they vetted Mark and I for you know, for our ability to listen and hear and be respectful. And we also in our very first meeting, set out some ground rules for listening to each other. So I think we very quickly we realized, Mark and I, that the lived experts are incredibly sophisticated and thoughtful about you know, what thriving is, and they can think theoretically, and we were mostly kind of along for the ride, because the big thinking kind of happened in the interviews. I found it so far pretty doable to maintain balance of power.
Yeah, I mostly emphasize just like being a good person in general, like virtue ethics stuff. So like be open, be honest, have goodwill, this kind of thing. That seems really important, particularly when talking to the lived experts, just let them talk. And then some things that are kind of, I guess, a bit more interesting is that we pay the lived experts like the London living wage, and we think that's really important. I'm kind of curious about like a Marxist perspective on that. Like, does that establish a kind of relationship of dominance? But we think that that's the kind of basic respect that you pay people for their time. And then we always make sure that we maintain open lines of communication with our lived experts, and always try to invite comments. So every 2 weeks in the process, I would send out a newsletter that kind of summarizes some of the themes emerging out of the process. And I would always say, please let me know if you have any thoughts. And I did quite frequently get comments from the lived experts, and then I would dialogue with them on those kind of things. And just, I don't know, there's a few other kind of bits of respect, like the disability rights guy, he said to me that he thinks it would be really important for everyone in society to read this book by Michael Oliver on disability rights. So I went and read the book just as a kind of sign of respect. So I don't know, just kind of things like that. But if you have any ideas on how we can improve that process going forward, I'd be very interested.
Yeah, I think, if I may, one of the thematic groups in the HTCA is participatory methods. And I feel like just the previous commentary and response there is a major recurring theme in that group. How to, I guess, remove power imbalances and really give voice and influence. Yeah, and there definitely is. It's hard to say whether there's an exact methodology. I mean, in some sense, it might be a kind of practical wisdom, enabling others to speak and kind of pulling those different values out and making them highlighted, and then allowing other people to comment on them. But it's definitely an interesting part of the process. Well, what does good deliberation look like, and how do we enable it? I think there will be follow-ups, but there's a number of questions at this point. So I'm going to jump to one other one from our committee, and then we have quite a few that I'll be kind of busy in the background collating the ones that we've gotten from the attendees. But one question about co-producing from the stakeholder members, and this from Raphael, another member of our committee. If you're co-producing from the point of view of not just lived experts, but also the professional experts, what different perspectives are prioritized? So does co-producing process include other lived experts that are not drawn solely from the poverty charity organizations, I guess, group of people that are served, which presumably is already a strong filter in picking out only people visibly seeking aid or support? So actually one thought that I had along this was that a lot of the people have probably already in some sense gained enough control of their lives to have these kinds of conversations. Were there ways to ensure that people who might be in more dire situations or just in different contexts related to not having work presently, or even not having a home presently, were able to respond or were being given consideration?
Thank you. These are really great questions. Thank you, Raphael and Travis. So on the first point of Raphael, why is it important to have the professional experts involved? It's tremendously important. And that is because the purview of the charity is a very specific one. It is helping you to get out of that immediate trouble, giving you the space to rebuild your life. It was extremely important to the workers of the charity that they not be in charge of people's thriving, that is, their job is not to make you thrive. Their job is to, um, well, it's, they had trouble articulating exactly what their job is, but it is very much sort of limited to helping you remove the immediate obstacles. So it was, while the lived experts could come up with all sorts of, highfalutin and grand ideas about what thriving is, as far as the charity is concerned, they need an account that is, practical and limited to their, their purview. I think that we learned that very quickly, and I think we really do respect that. As for including the people who were going through it, well, I mean, the ones we talked to had the space to reflect on what thriving was, but it's not like trouble wasn't far from them, right? It was very, very close. So I'm pretty sure we got got perspectives that are, that are realistic and representative of given that situation. I mean, there were few of them, but that's the nature of the exercise, right? Because we've committed to these deep conversations and long deliberation, we had to have the exercise small. Mark, does that sound right to you?
Yeah, that does sound right. The charity is quite committed to trying to reach people in different circumstances. So as part of their co-production in other aspects of their operation, they reach people who don't have internet access by giving them mobile phones or giving them internet dongles and things like that. And it has come up in our dialogue with people in the charity beyond the working group that they're concerned that people who are currently going through a crisis would have slightly different reflections on it. And we're talking about whether there's some way we can get that into the workshop. But the difficulty is that the charity also doesn't want to kind of overburden people who are going through the process. So that actually seems to be a point of tension within the charity itself. So we kind of don't touch that one. And then on people who are in really dire straits, the charity is working to try to reach more people and get more people to ask them for help. But I think that's kind of a little bit too hard for our particular problem, maybe.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to kind of pivot over, but try to keep some continuity here. So another question that I find myself thinking, and this relates to a question that was just asked from K. Mohan Raidu from Hyderabad. So that question is, will the measurement of well-being parameters include economic parameters only? So this is more of a specific question, I think, about the quantitative indicators that end up being selected. And the question says, most often the ethical practices prevailing in the living areas also affect the well-being. And if I may, one way I'm thinking around that is that there are different cultural understandings of value within different subgroups of people, what Martha Nussbaum calls a multiple realization, so that different senses of value or different ethical understandings of what well-being is, different senses of community or purposiveness or the purpose or process that makes one life meaningful are going to be held by different groups of people. For example, family members, or as we've said in the mid-level sense, say children or refugees, as opposed to middle-aged adults or people living with certain kinds of disabilities or disadvantages. So will those different cultural values and in some sense the different ethical practices affect the way that indicators are selected more so than merely being economic indicators? And for example, those that are typically used by most well-being measures. Mm-hmm. And yeah, if I'm also thinking again to the Yawuru research, right? The changing of the indicators so that they have more of a collective sense to them, or that they reflect the cultural values of one or another group.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. If you were to apply co-production in different contexts, I think the kind of prevailing cultural and normative opinions of those different contexts are going to become salient. And so you should end up with a diversity or a plurality of value judgments being made. I mean, I think it's almost inevitable, unless you are looking at a context that is very heavily dominated by economic issues, that you would end up with, I think, measures that are related to non-economic things if it is non-economic things that people care about. So in the case of our context, if we were to measure every individual item that came out as very salient, we would definitely want to have measures of these feelings of relatedness and competence and autonomy and things like that. And there is a foundation for some of these things in economic matters, but I think it's pretty clear from our raw data that these things are not really economic issues. They are other things.
Yeah, and so maybe just kind of a practical question around that. If they're not so much economic issues, do you have a sense at this point what kind of indicators you might be moving towards? Has there been some discussion of that?
So to recall, the charity needs to decide how much space they will be making for measurement in different parts of their activities. But one question that that we keep coming back to, and that I think will make it into indicators, is something like, do you have mental space to decide what is important to you? So do you know what you need to be doing in order to get on track? And so we're trying to capture the idea that poverty and financial stress takes away your ability to step back and think about what matters to you and what is important to you, because you're so focused on the big basics. So we'd like to figure out, we'd like to formulate a question along those lines, and it may, depending on how much space we're going to get from the charity, whether it's going to be a verbal question asked or whether it's going to be a survey question asked online, it is that will make a difference, right? So not ready to tell you any specific questions.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning that while the charity is very interested in the kind of holistic picture of thriving that comes out from this process, their work is specifically around helping people through a acute period of financial hardship. And so the questions that are most relevant to them are probably going to end up being mostly economic. I think if you redid the process in like a private school or something like that, so I don't know what it's like in other countries, but a school where people pay a lot of money to send their kids there, then these economic matters might not be quite so salient. Whereas issues of like, well, what are you going to do with your life? What are your values? But these kind of things, I think you'd end up with a different set of questions.
Okay.
If it's okay with you, Travis, I think this might be a good time to address a really good question by El Terzi.
We were just going to go there. That's nice.
Yeah, well, so it's a really fair question. The capabilities approach was formulated about justice, and you're using it as you're basically packing it in a theory of thriving. Could you explain that? So yeah, extremely unapologetic about that, right? So I've always thought that the best thing about the capabilities approach is that it is a formal framework that can be plugged into many different contexts and purposes, and turned to us specifically in order to help them design a conception of thriving. They didn't come to us for a conception of justice, and I think that is extremely important. So it's a credit to the flexibility and the importance of the capabilities approach, that it can do a lot of different work depending on the situation. I'm quite I'm very keen to hear to get some pushback on that idea. But I find that very attractive.
Yeah, there's another question in the Q&A and I'm struggling to kind of piece them together. So I appreciate from some of the comments that the way I talked about capabilities and functionings and stuff strikes people as a bit unorthodox. So I just thought I'd clarify my position. It's very heavily influenced by Sen's book in 1999, Capabilities and Commodities, I think it's called, which is very short and quite full of equations because I'm an economist, so that's sort of where I come from. And my understanding from that conceptualization is that capabilities are in a sense the option set. So what can you choose from? Functionings are then what beings and doings you actually choose to actualize. And then well-being is what you get from those functionings depending on how much you value the things that are in those functionings. And I think Sen in that book kind of really stays away from that last part, that well-being bit. And I think that is actually where the theory is the weakest. So the way I kind of port that over is that when I'm thinking about like health, for example, if I imagine two different people, so one person whose intrinsic motivations are to play video games and one person whose intrinsic motivation is to be an Olympic athlete, if I give the Olympic athlete's body to the video gamer, that's an expansion in their capabilities. They're not going to do anything with it in terms of functionings because they don't want to suddenly start doing Olympic athletics. They just want to keep playing video games. And they don't need an Olympic athlete's body in order to play video games. And if they started doing Olympic athletics, that would actually be bad for their well-being because they don't value that pursuit and they don't get feelings of competence from it, whereas they do get feelings of competence, for example, from playing the video games. So that's kind of how I think about it. And I've had a little bit of difficulty passing some of the questions here, but there was a comment about how my use of health, for example, was unorthodox. And so if I have gotten it very wrong there, please do push back on me. So in the theory that we've put forward here, the idea is that, yeah, the capabilities are having circuit breakers, having bandwidth, these kind of things. But then people need to choose the functionings, the beings and doings that are right for them. And I think what's kind of always struck me as maybe missing a bit is just how do we find out what's right for us?
If I may, just to clarify, I'm not sure if that question was actually in the Q&A. So there's a chat function that's circular to the panelists, and I think that question might have been from there. And then there's a question. So if I may, I'm just going to reread the question just so that the audience can catch up on it. So the question goes, the representation of the capability approach was maybe a bit unconventional. Income would probably be categorized as a means, not a capability on most accounts, although we might say that many multidimensional measures of capabilities do posit a dimension of income, recognizing that it is a means and not necessarily an end or a functioning. Health would most probably be a functioning or multiple, and what is valued is the functioning and the capability there too. So the capability to get to that functioning of health. Self-knowledge might be one functioning that has positive externalities or spillovers, following Wolf and Deschalet from 2007, and one may be able to form capabilities there too. So I guess the suggestion is that if we were to follow more so the capabilities approach in the way that it's presented from this member of our panel, then there would be a more specific illustration of the functionings and the different dimensions of capability that might be relevant than is presented thus far. And what I got from the sense of your presentation was a couple of different, what felt to me more like dimensions of value that are suggested as important by people. So maybe I'd ask, is there a way to connect those dimensions of value, such as being connected to other people or feeling like you have mental space, to maybe what might be considered more specific functionings following the capabilities approach? Yeah, I think that connects the question and reformulates it.
I mean, I worry here that I just don't have enough technical knowledge of what each of these terms mean. So I don't have an understanding of what the distinction is between a means and a capability. Because as I take it from that 1999 book by Sen, these are the same thing. Like the means are the option set, or they expand the option set. So they function in a similar way. But I take it that that's not the view in a lot of the literature. So I just can't answer it until I know those terms a bit better.
I think option set is a pretty good handle on it. as far as just, I think, yeah, so some technical details, but just to pan back, I think one thing that's relevant to say here is, and this goes to the previous comment, part of what you're talking about is what the measure is to be used for. And so what you'll end up getting is something that's very specific to be used for a group of people that are facing some significant challenges in their context. And so it might not be necessary to parse functionings in such a specific way, and instead go to something more general, like, do you feel like you have the mental space that you need? Or do you have the ability to get into one or another approach to an occupation that you find to be valuable, or something like that? All right. Number of other questions. Let's see. Yeah, I'm going to read it. Isabella is good. Somebody else is with me here. So this from one of our participants, attendees, Isabella Sanchez Vargas. If we think in a democratic welfare measurement, let me try that again. If we think regarding democratic welfare measurement as applied to another space, like a rural community or an informal settlement, what criteria do you suggest taking into account when choosing all the relevant stakeholders? Which seems to be I think that would be a repeat, but if we're moving into more of a rural community or an informal settlement, so maybe not so much so the urban context.
It's a very important question, and I thank Isabella for asking it very much. So here's where I think we need to start. We need to start with the purpose of well-being measurement, right? So presumably the well-being data that you are going to collect aren't just going to sit there. Well, they could, right? So for instance, who are the relevant stakeholders in in a large kind of scale Office of National Statistics? It's not really clear. Their function is to represent the diversity of life in the UK, right? It's not clear that a lot is going to be done with these data. It's not clear that these data are going to be used to, decide how we apportion welfare or anything like that. Their function is representational. So that means your stakeholders are users of these data, so researchers, and of course, the citizenry. Whereas in a small scale situation like Isabella is describing, the first question to answer is what's going to happen with those measurements? Are they going to be used to decide, about how many schools and hospitals do we need, or about how we apportion our scarce resources? Are they going to be used for forward planning, right? And once you have that kind of story about usage, then you'll be able to identify the stakeholders. So the stakeholders are people who are going to have to know what to do with this knowledge, right? So in our case, these are the social workers, right? They're the ones who need to know how to use the data about thriving in order to help their partners and help the people who come to them. So that gives us a very so I think that's where you start from. I wonder whether that answers your question, Isabella. You have to start from the purpose for which you're collecting measures. Once you have specified the purposes, there will be clear groups of people who are going to be in charge of translating these measures into actions. So they are definitely going to have to be the stakeholders. I don't know whether I have any more formal things to say about how to select. It's such an important question, and I hope that there is a formal account of that coming from somewhere else.
Yeah, I just said that I think the capabilities literature has been really path-breaking on a lot of this work, doing it in developing countries and places where power imbalances are really tricky and also quite unusual to a Western eye. So, if you come to a community and you think, oh, well, I need to ask these people about their values, but there's a particular group that kind of really speaks for the community, but you're not sure whether they're kind of like democratically endorsed. Should you speak to them or should you speak to the citizens or stuff like that. My immediate reaction to your question was, well, it's going to depend a lot on the context. And I think Anna's given a very good general account, and I'd just be kind of scared to say much more than that.
So I'd like to ask a follow-up question in some sense with what was just asked, also related to these questions about context. I'm wondering if in your research you've had any concerns regarding adaptive preferences, and whether or not people are relaying. What we know from some of the research is that if people are educated, or if certain understandings of what might be important to them are made available, sometimes their preferences and their values around those preferences do shift significantly. Is there any concern that there might be that kind of shift of understandings of value, or even the intensity of different values from different stakeholders, different lived experts, or different other experts as you're going through this process?
Yeah, for
Good
sure.
question.
So,
Mark, you go.
Yeah, so at least one of the lived experts really explicitly said that they had adaptive preferences, and many of them talked about how they'd sort of internalized values, thought they were doing well, then had a lifestyle change or a life-changing event, or just were slowly incepted by their colleagues, things like that. And as a result of that, they had a kind of transformation in their preferences, and then they saw that their life was bad, and then they changed their life, and then they saw it was good. And then I think you run into the problem of endogenous preferences, which revealed preference theory has been struggling with for a very long time. They're like, which set of preferences are we to take as welfare relevant? And I think I can't really answer that question. I am actually working on a paper about that at the moment. And I think the essential quality of that paper, but it's not really relevant to this research, is that if you do want to take preferences as a welfare relevant criterion, then you need to have some sort of understanding of what are kind of good preferences. And economics has generally thought about it in terms of well-laundered preferences, which kind of approximate rationality axioms. I think that's really bad because it's not psychologically realistic. And so what we actually want is something like agentic preferences, where we can identify that the person has kind of practical wisdom and these kind of things. But I'd need to talk much longer about what kind of psychological ideas we draw on to explain this notion of agentic preferences. Anna, do you have anything on that?
No, that sounds great.
Thank you. I'm going to read another question, this one from Simon Hallniker. And I just want to say that as we draw this to a close, thank you to our attendees for being here, and great questions from panelists, and also to our speakers. When we end the recording, we're going to hang out for a couple of minutes, so please feel free to stay on. Yeah, we'll try to fit one or two more questions in, and then draw this webinar to a close. So from Simon, hello, and thanks for the interesting presentation. One, what are the challenges in scaling up the approach to further increase democratic legitimacy? And two, how did you or would you deal with persisting disagreement in the workshop?
On the first question, the challenges, theoretically, the challenges are that the wider scope you've got for your stakeholders, the more the conceptions of thriving will be uninformative and will sort of turn into this kind of just platitudes about what matters and what doesn't. We were able to discover something we really didn't know, precisely because we were so specific. You know, it's up for grabs how much that will be possible. I think it's an empirical question. As for dealing with persistent disagreements in the workshop, well, it hasn't come to it yet, but we are sort of under no illusions that that is possible, and that you know, eventually. I think there was another question there about aggregation of preferences and voting rules. So maybe that's a possibility to consider those. I think our first goal was not to come to our exercise with preferences that needed to be aggregated. No. We wanted to form preferences as part of the conversation. That was the whole point. We wanted to find a set of vocabulary by which we're going to describe well-being, and we haven't come across any kind of genuine, like, one person say, no, I don't think that's well-being. Another person said, yeah, no, I'm going to, over my dead body, we have to have that in the measure. We haven't been there precisely because we have sought to find a new vocabulary to describe thriving of people in those situations. And this vocabulary emerged in the conversation. We have not thought to resolve deep disagreements that already, people who already came to this exercise. But if we had to, then I guess we're just going to have to fall back to whatever is, normal, whatever is different political theories recommend. Well, we don't have any special bespoke recipes there.
Yeah. Just mostly pray that we don't have such major disagreement, but I guess I'd hope that we solve it through some kind of communicative rationality where people debate it out in a polite and civil manner. We have had some of that so far, like particularly with T, one of our social workers. She was very concerned that the charity was, in a sense, like discriminating about who's deserving and undeserving poor. And we had quite a long kind of back and forth about that. And I think I adjusted my opinion slightly and she adjusted her view of the charity and kind of accepted that they're under an ethical prerogative from the original endower of the charity, that they have to stick to their remit, but that they try and do bits and pieces around that. So it'd be interesting to see at the workshop if we get more kind of combativeness, but I think the open-ended time frame and the kind of tone that we try to bring to the process means that people can usually work out their disagreements rather than just be obstinate.
I want to ask a quick question, then, if I may. I guess I'll take advantage of my space as key facilitator here and try to get the last question. When you get to that workshop space, assuming that you are going to have to narrow your indicators relative to the purpose that the charity has, do you think that there might be some disagreement, like what exactly the 2 or 3 questions are that you would ask in a quick survey, or what exactly the 2 or 3 things are, or 5 or 7 things are that you'd want to look into to make sure that a person is doing better, or maybe to recognize the person is lacking in some sense of the well-being or thriving that's relevant. It's likely that there will be some conflict there. So do you have some thoughts about how you will negotiate that process?
Thank you. So the conflict that I foresee, and I don't think that is something that is resolvable by any academic means, is, do you quantify or do you not? So perhaps some people high up in the leadership of the organization, such as Turn to Us, are going to want to show benchmarks, like we have helped that many people to improve by that much. So, and we want to select those social workers who help such improvement, and eliminate those who don't, and that is of course tremendously controversial, the management by indicators and decision making by indicators, and very quickly indicators can turn into the thing that is being valued for its own sake instead of just as an indicator. Do I have a solution to that? I don't think so, because that's a very general problem of the audit society. I'll speak out about the dangers of producing benchmarks that then lead to very consequential decisions.
I just have 2 short comments. So one is, I think if they're not irreconcilable, kind of incompatible approaches to measurement, then I think the charity would be open to experimenting. There's a few different places where they can try different things, or even within one realm, they can ask different sort of questions and try to assess over time which one turned out to be more effective for them. And the other thing was that in one application in particular, like the grants, and they have this narrow number of people who are ongoing grant recipients or get multiple grants. The theory itself is useful as a kind of sense checking device. So if I'm a caseworker, my measure of whether this person is thriving is more of just a kind of instinct. I don't even necessarily need to ask them a question, but my intuitions are honed by having the theory. And then I ask a question, I get some open-ended feedback, I can make sense of it. And I think that's an interesting kind of angle on measurement. Just before I forget, because I know we're wrapping up, there's an anonymous question in the chat about self-determination theory. You can definitely recognize it in the theory, but I didn't want to bring it in too much because the language of self-determination theory was not itself that present in the raw data. It's more a theoretical framework that makes sense of it very well. I personally have quite a few papers on self-determination theory, so if that author is interested, they can send me an email and I'll communicate with them.
Okay. Thank you very much, getting to our attendees, panelists, and speakers. This has been fascinating and I think quite thought-provoking, hopefully for all involved. So well wishes to all around the world. We'll end the recording at this point and then we'll hang out for a couple of minutes. But thank you again to all.
Thanks.
Sharing the research.
Tremendous audience, so many people. Yeah.
Brilliant questions as well. I really appreciate to everybody who left comments and questions. I will definitely save this precious feedback.